If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you the most brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hocton. For me, John F. Kennedy has always stood as a symbol, I suppose, of youthful optimism and modern leadership during one of the most incredibly tense and uncertain periods in global history. As the 35th President of the United States, he faced down the Cuban Missile Crisis, he championed civil rights, and he launched the bold Apollo space program, all before the age of 46. His charisma, his eloquence, and tragic assassination in 1963 sealed his legacy for me as a transformative figure. I think who inspired, certainly my generation to believe in public service progress and the power of American idealism at the absolute height of what was then the Cold War. I've just finished reading two books by Mark White, who is Professor of History at Queen Mary's University of London. The first one is titled Icon, Libertine, Leader, The Life and Presidency of John F. Kennedy. And then his other book, Kennedy, A Cultural History of American Icon. And all things considered, I have to say, especially with what's unfolding in America today, it actually feels like the right moment to revisit Kennedy's incredible legacy. Take leadership in a divided nation, for instance. Kennedy governed at a time of deep social fractures, civil rights protests, Cold War paranoia, generational upheaval. Does that sound familiar? How he handled those challenges, sometimes with incredible inspiration and at other times kind of imperfectly, still offers very valuable lessons for the kind of leadership people are craving today. Then there's the power of hope and idealism. In contrast to today's widespread cynicism, Kennedy's call to civic duty, remember, ask not what your country can do for you, and his kind of moonshot vision embodied a form of patriotism that transcended party politics. It's hard not to wonder, where did that incredible American spirit go? White also touches on Kennedy's mastery of media and public image and how that shaped the modern presidency. And of course, JFK's foreign policy, Cuba, Berlin, Vietnam, still echoes today as America, I think, continues to redefine its place on the world stage. In my mind, no president has captivated the public imagination quite like Kennedy. His glamorous image, his progressive politics, and of course his tragic death. These have all become part of an enduring American myth. But in Icon, Libertine, Leader, White takes a more balanced approach, delving into, I suppose, the contradictions of Kennedy's character. The bold, the visionary leadership on the one hand, the reckless, often, kind of troubling private behavior on the other. And to his credit, I think he handles the complexity of that situation incredibly well. So I thought I'd begin by looking at the different schools of thought surrounding Kennedy's character and leadership since his assassination in 1963, some 62 years ago, and where Mark White's Icon, Libertine, Leader fits into the wider story of JFK's evolving historical reputation. Kennedy's standing with the American public has always remained remarkably high. If you look at poll rankings where people are asked to rate US presidents, JFK consistently places always in the top three, alongside Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. In some surveys, he's even ranked as the greatest president in American history. So in terms of his popularity with the American people, it's remained incredibly strong and very steady over that period of time. His reputation among scholars, though, tells a very much more, I think, complicated story. For roughly the first decade after his assassination in downtown Dallas in November 1963, the dominant view was that Kennedy had been a great president. That perception was partly shaped by a pivotal moment just 1 week after his death. Jacqueline Kennedy gave a now famous interview to journalist Theodore White for Life magazine, which had a massive readership at the time, over 1 million. It was exactly 7 days after the assassination, and I really don't know how she did it. And in that interview, Jackie deliberately, and I think also strategically, introduced a powerful metaphor. She mentioned that she and her late husband often listened to a record of Camelot, the Broadway musical about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Theodore White, who was a seasoned journalist at the time, took the cue and ran with it. His article led with the Camelot theme, reinforcing the idea that JFK's presidency was almost mythic, a lost golden age, much like Arthurian legend. Jackie had essentially cast her husband as a modern-day King Arthur, and the American public embraced that metaphor with everything they had. JFK had come to embody a kind of graceful, chivalric leadership, and that image had a very powerful influence on the first wave of Kennedy scholarship, often referred to as the Camelot School. The two key figures in that group were Theodore Sorensen, who was JFK's chief speechwriter, and of course Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a renowned historian who served in the Kennedy White House. In 1965, both men published major works that helped shape Kennedy's early historical reputation. Schlesinger's 1,000 Days and Sorensen's Kennedy painted him as a heroic leader, a president who fought valiantly for peace abroad, stood firm against the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and pushed for civil rights at home. These books were deeply admiring, written by people who'd not only witnessed history, but had also helped craft it. They were there, and their influence, I think, was enormous. But by the 1970s and probably into the 1980s, the narrative began to shift. A wave of revelations surfaced, particularly about Kennedy's private life. It became clear that he had been a prolific philanderer, involved in numerous affairs. At the same time, the fallout from the Vietnam War, America's first ever major defeat, was becoming impossible to ignore. While Kennedy hadn't sent combat troops, he had escalated U.S. involvement significantly by increasing the number of military advisors. As the war turned into a national trauma, many began to hold him partly responsible. These developments had a profound impact on how historians assessed his presidency. In the 1980s and 1990s, a more critical school of thought started to emerge. It didn't have a formal name, but let's call it, for the better use of this particular podcast, the Counter-Camelot School. This revisionist wave was marked by 3 influential books. There was Gary Will's The Kennedy Imprisonment, there was Thomas Reeves' A Question of Character, and then Seymour Hersh's The Dark Side of Camelot. These works actually dug really deep into the contradictions, the flaws, the darker side of the Kennedy legacy, and they helped topple this heroic myth that had once defined him. The books from the Counter-Camelot School were, in many ways, I think, savage takedowns of Kennedy's legacy, and they focused their criticism on 2 main fronts. First, they portrayed him as an aggressive Cold Warrior who made the global situation more dangerous than it actually needed to be. And they pointed to his significant increase in U.S. military spending, his escalation of American involvement in Vietnam, and his relentless attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro. And they included, various plots to assassinate the Cuban leader. And according to this view, Kennedy had actually contributed to global instability rather than easing it. Second, they attacked his private life and character. Thomas Reeves, in his 1991 book, A Question of Character, actually argued that great leadership must be rooted in personal integrity and a very strong moral compass, qualities he believed Kennedy completely lacked. Reeves claimed that JFK's numerous affairs and reckless personal behavior were not just private flaws, but signs of a deeper moral failing that really undermined his entire presidency. That said, not all scholars followed this particularly harsh line. Over time, a more balanced middle ground perspective began to emerge, one that acknowledged Kennedy's flaws without dismissing his incredible achievements. Several books adopted this more moderate tone, neither, I suppose, ionizing nor vilifying him. As for where I stand during this debate, I spent years thinking about Kennedy, and my view today is more positive than negative, especially when I compare him to some of the presidents who came after him. Honestly, the more I look at modern American politics, the better JFK seems. Let me walk you through some of the reasons why I think Kennedy deserves more credit than he was given in the 1980s. One of the things I admire about him is his capacity for growth. Very early in his presidency, he was a staunch Cold Warrior. He ramped up military spending, he supported covert operations to unseat Castro, and he was hesitant to take a stand firm on civil rights, despite it being the defining domestic issue of his time. But, and this is where it's really important, because over the course of his presidency, he evolved. His handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, for me, was a very, very clear turning point. Faced with the imminent threat of nuclear war, he chose diplomacy and restraint over aggression. That experience seemed to deepen his understanding of the Cold War and the absolutely terrifying risks of nuclear brinkmanship. In 1963, he delivered a remarkable speech at American University in Washington, D.C., urging Americans to rethink their attitude towards the Russian people and the Cold War itself. That same year, he signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was a landmark step in curbing the arms race and reducing global tensions. On the domestic front, particularly in terms of civil rights, another major turning point came in the spring of 1963 with the crisis in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King Jr. had called it the most racially segregated city in the American South. That spring, King and other civil rights leaders organized peaceful protests in Birmingham, many of which included women and children. And the response from the local police was absolutely brutal. Images of children being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs were splashed across the front of newspapers, not just across the country, throughout the entire world. Kennedy, by his own admission, was sickened by what he saw. I think that moment changed him. It led to what I believe is the greatest speech of his life, greater even than his iconic inauguration address. On June the 11th, 1963, JFK addressed the nation and, for the first time in the 20th century, a sitting American president framed civil rights not just a legal or political issue, but as a moral one. In that speech, he asked Americans to reconsider the meaning of equality and justice in their country. And soon after, he introduced a civil rights bill aimed at ending racial segregation in the South. Though Kennedy wouldn't live to see it pass because he died in 1963, that bill would eventually become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed by Lyndon Johnson. So when it comes to policy, what I really credit Kennedy for is his amazing capacity for growth. He wasn't static. He listened, he learned, and he changed. What then about the question of Kennedy's character? Look, I would argue that the Counter-Camelot School was absolutely right to shine a spotlight on his private life because it was extraordinary. I mean, I love researching ancient Rome, and frankly, JFK's personal life often reads more like that of an early Roman emperor than a modern democratic leader. It's almost unbelievable. Take just two examples of affairs that had real serious implications, though there were actually very, very many that didn't. First, from 1960 to 1962, Kennedy had an affair with a woman named Judith Campbell. During that same period, Judith Campbell was also involved with Sam Garciana, the head of the Chicago Mafia. For context, Judith Campbell had actually been introduced to both men by Frank Sinatra. Then in 1963, he began a sexual relationship with a woman called Ellen Romtesh. Kennedy was told that she was from West Germany and married to a West German official. In fact, she wasn't. She was actually from East Germany. She was a known prostitute in the high circles, and she was a signed-up communist. While she wasn't actually a spy, the possibility was very real. And the fact that JFK would take such a reckless risk, it's really quite telling. Sexual blackmail is a well-worn tactic in espionage, and this episode reveals just how vulnerable he had actually made himself. So yes, I agree with those scholars who've argued that this aspect of his character actually matters, because I think it does. But here's the nuance. The problem with the counter-Camelot approach is that it tends to define character far too narrowly. It equates character almost entirely with sexual morality. But character is far more complex than that, and it's made up of many, many traits. When you step back and look at Kennedy as a whole, you also see tremendous courage. He showed this in World War II, where he was decorated for bravery. He showed it in his personal life too. He lived with chronic illness, including Addison's disease. And as I've said, he actually demonstrated, I think, an incredibly rare capacity to learn and to grow as a leader. Some policy decisions carry a clear moral weight. Civil rights, for example. Do you believe people are equal or not? And if you do, are you willing to act on it, even at political cost? In the final phase of his presidency, Kennedy took a strong and principled stance on civil rights. And he did so knowing full well that it would cost him support, particularly amongst the white Southern voters. And to me, that actually speaks volumes about this man's character. And of course, that's exactly what happens. The impact of Kennedy's civil rights stance is immediate. And if you look at his polling numbers, they were always consistently high until the final months of his life, when they suddenly plummeted in the South. And this was just 1 year out from the 1964 presidential election, where he was actually planning to run for a second term. So even knowing full well that his support would take a hit, and it did, he still chose to back civil rights. Why? Because he believed it was the morally right thing to do. That again speaks to the complexity of JFK's character. Yes, there was the sexual recklessness, but there were also deeply admirable traits. And that balance, I think, is essential when you're judging a leader. Another area where I think historians haven't paid enough attention is Kennedy's image, specifically his incredible, Hollywood-style glamour. He had a striking, charismatic presence, and it wasn't accidental. He cultivated it. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, made a fortune, initially in the unregulated stock markets of the 1920s, but he was also a Hollywood producer. So from a very young age, JFK was immersed in a world where image, presentation, and perception were understood as incredibly powerful tools. And there's a brilliant anecdote from 1946, just after World War II. Kennedy goes to California and he's staying with friends and he's spending time in and around Hollywood. And one friend remembered how fascinated he was by movie stars, Clark Gable, James Stewart, Cary Grant, Marlon Brando in the early 1950s. Kennedy actually studied them. He wanted to know, what is it about these men that makes them so captivating? What's in their posture, their voice, their walk? How do they command a room when they walk into it? And he studied all of that meticulously. And I believe he went on to craft one of the most magnetic, seductive images of any political leader in the history of Western democracy. I honestly can't think of another Democratic leader with the same level of glamour. And I don't think that's a trivial detail. I think that's actually fundamental to understanding his success. You cannot explain why he won the presidency without factoring in that image. Take the 1960 campaign as an example. He was actually running against Republican candidate Richard Nixon. And for most of that race, the polls actually had Kennedy slightly behind. But guess when it changed? Everything changed with the first ever televised presidential debate. People who listened on the radio thought it was pretty much a draw, but those who watched it on television, by far the majority, thought Kennedy completely destroyed Nixon. And that debate is now iconic, and it underscored one key truth. In the television age, image matters. And you know what? No one understood that better than JFK. After the first televised debate with Nixon, the shift was immediate. The next round of polling showed Kennedy moving ahead at a rapid rate, and then he stayed ahead, ultimately winning the 1960 election. So without that incredibly powerful image, it's entirely possible that he wouldn't have become president at all. You know, his visual charisma translated into a kind of aspirational magic. You know, men wanted to be like him, to dress like him. They envied him, but they also admired him. There was a sense of cool. He had control and he had confidence, and that made him magnetic to one and all. Then there's the data. Kennedy holds the highest average approval rating of any modern US president, going all the way back to World War II. That's over 75 years. No president has come close. You know, he averaged a 70% approval rating throughout his presidency. In contrast, many of the modern presidents would have been thrilled to have hit that number just once. Kennedy maintained it over the course of his entire 1,000 days in office. Of course, you know, part of that reflects how the public viewed his policies, but not all of it. Let's be fair. You know, that sustained popularity also speaks to the power of his image. Take, for example, the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. It was, without question, the biggest foreign policy failure of his presidency and an embarrassing and costly attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro. And yet, in the first public opinion poll, after that fiasco, his approval rating actually hit 80%. So that's clearly not a reaction to effective policy. It's a reaction to the man himself, how he dealt with the situation, how he carried himself, how he addressed the public, how he made people feel, which is why I think you simply can't explain Kennedy's presidency or even his election without acknowledging the central role of image. Now, just for a second, I'd like to widen the lens a little because there's another side to Kennedy that's just as compelling, his political ideology, specifically his stance on liberalism. It's easy to think of JFK as, I don't know, I guess the quintessential liberal icon, you know, a kind of modern heir to Franklin Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. And certainly that's how the public often remembered him, you know, after his assassination in 1963. But there's a more complicated and more interesting picture, I think, to explore. And I think also, interestingly, that's not how Kennedy saw himself for most of his political career. You know, at one point, just after he entered politics, actually, but before becoming president, he flat out said, "I'm not a liberal and never have been. I've never trusted those liberals." He actually viewed them with great suspicion, you know, considering figures like, you know, Adlai Stevenson II, you know, who was the Democratic presidential nominee in 1952 and 1956, as politically naive. In Kennedy's mind, if you wanted to win elections in America, you had to be a moderate. You had to hold the political center. You know, winning from the left of the Democratic Party, to him, just wasn't realistic. And Stevenson's back-to-back defeats to Republican, you know, Dwight Eisenhower only reinforced that belief. To Kennedy, I think it proved that idealism and intellect weren't enough. You also needed pragmatism and broad appeal. He also saw many liberals as really kind of sanctimonious. And when it came to foreign policy, JFK leaned distinctively hawkish for much of his early career. He actually firmly believed that the US had to increase military spending to effectively face off against the Soviet Union from a position of strength, and that America needed to be prepared to act with toughness in any Cold War crisis. Bowing to the Soviets, acquiescing to the Soviets was never an issue. Domestically, he wasn't a natural liberal either. But, you know, he did begin to adopt some liberal positions as he prepared for the 1960 election, without doubt. You know, after all, to win the Democratic nomination, he needed to secure the support of the party's liberal wing. So he started backing policies that would appeal to them. Still, Kennedy saw himself as a centrist Democrat, similar, I think, in some ways to how Bill Clinton would position himself in the 1990s, or Tony Blair in the United Kingdom with his vision of a modern Labour Party. That said, I think he changed, and he changed to his credit. One of the things I've always argued is that presidents, like all of us, are shaped by experience. They should be open to learning from their time in office. They should evolve. And JFK, in my view, absolutely did. The Cuban Missile Crisis certainly changed him. It gave him a deep personal understanding of how close the world had come to nuclear annihilation. Nuclear war was no longer a distant abstraction, and it had nearly happened. And I think from that moment, Kennedy became more committed to reducing Cold War tensions. And of course, as I mentioned, he signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and he started advocating for diplomacy over escalation. And I have to smile because while I'm talking to you about this and going through these thoughts, of course, my mind is currently going to current situations that we face. Anyway, I digress. And then on civil rights, we see another shift. In the final years of his life, he became a much stronger supporter of civil rights, despite knowing it can actually cost him politically. Of course, he didn't know it would be the final year of his life, but that makes the change no less meaningful. So yes, in that last phase of his presidency, Kennedy moved to the left. He embraced more liberal, progressive policies. But for the majority of his political life, I think it's fair to say he considered himself a centrist Democrat. Open-minded, for sure. Pragmatic, absolutely. And I think also very politically strategic. And I think there's one other issue that's worth mentioning here, particularly when kind of thinking about how Kennedy was perceived by other Democrats. And that's his response to McCarthyism in the early 1950s. It was, without question, the biggest political crisis of his pre-presidential life. At the time, the dominant issue in American politics was the Red Scare. In February 1950, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin stood up and claimed that the U.S. government, especially the State Department, had been infiltrated by communists and traitors. That accusation lit a political firestorm. McCarthyism became a national obsession, which led to the most horrendous blacklists. It led to loyalty tests and to a climate of fear and suspicion throughout the United States. Fast forward a few years, and McCarthy's behavior has become so extreme that the U.S. Senate finally moves to censor him for unethical conduct. And when the censure vote came, nearly every senator supported it. Almost every single one, including most Democrats, but not Kennedy. In fact, JFK was the only Democratic senator who didn't vote to censure McCarthy. Why? Well, part of it was personal. McCarthy was a family friend. He was very close to the Kennedys. They socialized regularly. And Kennedy's younger brother, Bobby, had actually worked for McCarthy on his Senate committee. So it would have been incredibly difficult on a personal level for JFK to take a public stand against him. Still, that decision shocked many within the Democratic Party, especially the party's liberal wing. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was still very much, a public figure at the time, was actually appalled by Kennedy's failure to oppose McCarthyism. To her and others, it actually looked like Kennedy was putting personal loyalty above principle, above party, and above country. Does this sound familiar? This episode really crystallized the uneasy relationship Kennedy had with prominent liberals in his party. It actually created long-standing tensions with people like Eleanor Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson. That friction remained well into JFK's presidency. Despite the public image of unity within the Democratic Party, Kennedy's centrist instincts and political caution, it often set him apart from the party's liberal standard bearers. So if Kennedy's stance on McCarthy can be seen as a political flaw, or at the very least, a moral blind spot, then there's another, even more troubling element of his character that deserves attention: his philandering. I've touched on it earlier, but it's worth exploring more deeply here. The scale of it, both in how it was carried out and how it was covered up, is absolutely staggering. It's a dark and complex part of his legacy, and I want to be clear about where I stand on it, especially in terms of how it affects his overall reputation. And just before we go there, it's time for a message from our sponsor. Altadomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altadomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So, Kennedy's philandering. Part of the roots of his behavior lie in his upbringing. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was a well-known playboy who actively encouraged his sons to behave the same way. And, that kind of parental example laid the groundwork for a very permissive and often entitled attitude towards women. But I think it also goes deeper than just inherited behavior. In a medical sense, JFK was one of the sickest presidents in American history. His health was actually appalling from a young age. In the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s, he struggled with severe colitis. He was diagnosed with Addison's disease, which is actually a condition where the adrenal glands don't produce enough hormones. And at that time, it was actually considered fatal. On top of that, he suffered from chronic, debilitating spinal issues. In 1954, he underwent major spinal surgery that actually went very badly at first, and his condition became so critical that he was actually given the last rites, not once, but twice. So he lived with a constant awareness of his own fragility. He knew he might not live a long life. And I think that had a really psychological effect. There was something in him, some deep personal sense of his own morality that helped fuel a kind of hedonism, a belief. Since his time might be short, he might as well live as intensely as he could while he could. And that attitude didn't just shape his relationship. I think it actually defined his entire private life. Look, I'm not a psychohistorian by any means, but it's actually worth asking, could Kennedy's famously frosty relationship with his mother and his apparent lack of respect for her have translated into a broader lack of respect for women in his private life? I mean, it's speculation, of course, but what we do know is this, that he was a lifelong philanderer and marriage actually made no difference whatsoever. He actually met Jacqueline Bouvier and married her in 1953. It was the society wedding of the year. It was front page news across the globe. And yet, it had no discernible impact on his behavior whatsoever. In fact, just weeks before the wedding, he reportedly began an affair with a Swedish aristocrat, a relationship that he actually resumed shortly after he and Jackie were married. And of course, that pattern continued throughout his life and well into his presidency. During his time in the White House, he had an affair with Judith Campbell, who, as I mentioned earlier, was also romantically involved with Sam Garciana, the head of the Chicago Mafia. I couldn't think of a worse person to have an affair with. That being said, in terms of emotional depth, I think the most significant relationship seems to have been with Mary Meyer, who was a bohemian artist, effectively from JFK's own kind of social circle. They'd known each other for a long time, certainly since the 1930s. And there was evidence to suggest that their connection was more than physical and that there was genuine feeling between both of them. That story takes a dark and extraordinary turn. About a year after Kennedy's assassination, Mary Meyer was actually shot and killed while walking along a canal in Washington, D.C. The killing was very close range, it was professional, and it was clinical. And by the time she was actually having an affair with Kennedy, she was actually divorced from her husband. That, of course, has fueled heaps of speculation. What did she know about JFK? How much had they confided in one another? And I guess the question is, was this simply a tragic random murder or something more sinister? I guess we'll never know. And of course, then there's Marilyn Monroe, easily the most famous of Kennedy's affairs. While biographers differ on the timeline, it's widely believed that their relationship actually took place in 1961 and 1962. So if you work out the dates, Kennedy's actually having multiple affairs at this particular time. Add to that the East German, Ellen Romtesch, the East German call girl who has potential intelligence ties. And of course, then we also know that there were at least 4 women, White House staff, administrative secretaries, who, according to multiple sources, he was regularly sleeping with during his presidency. So when you put Kennedy's private life in the broader context of the modern presidency, the behavior, of course, isn't unique. Warren Harding had affairs, so did Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower had affairs, Lyndon Johnson, George W. Bush, and of course, then there was Bill Clinton. What strikes me, though, is the disproportionate attention that we put on JFK's philandering endeavors. Lyndon Johnson, as an example, openly bragged about the number of affairs that he'd had, and he once claimed to have had more extramarital sex than any other president except Kennedy. And yet, in the major biographies of Johnson, that part of his life is often downplayed or brushed aside because he doesn't have the Hollywood image. With Kennedy, it's the opposite. His affairs actually dominate the conversation, especially in later biographies. And I wonder if that has something to do with his glamour. Paradoxically, that charm and allure may have become a liability, certainly a posthumous liability, making people more fascinated, more obsessed with the sexual side of his life simply because of the golden image that he projected. Tall poppies. For certain, it was a major part of his life, including during his presidency. But as I've said, he's hardly alone in that regard. In JFK's case, however, there were at least 2 clear and serious lapses of judgment. The affair with Judith Campbell, who was also involved with Sam Garciana. I can't stop laughing about that. That was incredibly reckless in the extreme. And of course, there was the relationship with Ellen Romtesch, a woman, who later was to be revealed to be an East German prostitute. Nothing catastrophic resulted from either liaison, or actually, as I'm thinking about that, did it. But they were extraordinary security risks, ones that never should have been taken by a sitting president. And one more thing that's crucial to acknowledge here is the difference in media culture. And this is actually really important. What JFK could get away with in the early 1960s is worlds apart from what Bill Clinton faced in the 1990s. Clinton knew going into his relationship with Monica Lewinsky that if the press found out, it would be a massive, massive story. And of course it was. Kennedy, on the other hand, operated in, I suppose, a bit of a media landscape governed by very unspoken gentlemanly rules. Journalists at the time, especially, the responsible kind of Washington press corps, did not report on a president's private life. They saw that as completely out of bounds. And we even have a quote from Kennedy himself acknowledging this. He once said, "They can't get me whilst I'm alive. They can't report on any of this whilst I'm alive. And when I'm dead, it's not something I'm really bothered about." He knew he wasn't taking a political risk, certainly not in the way that Clinton did many years later. So while the affairs may not have been politically explosive at the time, they certainly still raise serious ethical questions. And that, I think, is the heart of the matter. My take is that you can't ignore it. You can't simply say, well, this is his private life. We should only judge him by his policies. Some of what Kennedy did in private involved such extraordinary risk-taking that it absolutely demands scrutiny because of the position that he held. That said, I don't believe his personal behavior impacted his presidency in terms of policy. In fact, what stands out the most to me is the contrast between how he lived privately and how he lived publicly. Privately, he was a complete gambler. He took massive risks, often needlessly, often recklessly. There was a kind of macho bravado that kind of played out in his personal life. But in his policymaking, he was far more cautious, restrained, and pragmatic. And there's a striking contradiction between the two. If Kennedy were truly as reckless and macho in office as he was in his personal life, then you would argue, why didn't he escalate further during the Bay of Pigs disaster? He had a chance to send in US troops and salvage, that failed invasion. Some of his advisors wanted him to do it, but he refused. And if he were truly trigger happy, Why didn't he send combat troops into South Vietnam when he was again urged to do so? He held back. And more significantly, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when many of his advisors were actually calling out for an immediate bombing campaign against Cuba, why didn't he go through with it? Instead, he chose a naval blockade and pursued back-channel diplomacy. For someone supposedly driven by ego and testosterone, those were not the decisions of a reckless man. They were the decisions of a careful, measured leader. So you see the split. In private life, high risk, high appetite for danger. In public policy, caution, deliberation, restraint. And I think the key to maintaining that divide between, the reckless private man and the private public statesman was image. I've already mentioned, how carefully he kind of created his Hollywood-style persona. But I think we also have to consider the role of Jackie Kennedy in all of this. I think it's very important. She wasn't just a fashionable first lady. She was part of the image architecture that helped Kennedy, I think, project the idea of a modern, glamorous, aspirational American family. And that just fascinates me, not just in JFK's case, but in the way modern leaders craft their image more broadly. This isn't a superficial fluff. This is a core part of political craft today. Are you able to project an image that resonates with all the people, or the majority of the people, one that they can specifically relate to and admire? What changed everything, in my view, is what happened in American culture in the 1950s. In that decade, television ownership skyrocketed. At the start of the 1950s, only about 10% of American households had a television. By 1960, the year that JFK ran for president, that number had jumped to 90%. And I think that's really, really transformative. It redefined how politicians were seen, how campaigns were fought, and how presidents were judged. Think about the recent debate between Biden and Trump. So suddenly with the rise of television, how you look, your visual image, it really matters. Of course, image, I think, has always played a role in leadership throughout the centuries. If you go back to the Roman emperors or to Elizabeth I in England, rulers were intensely aware of how they were perceived when they were in public. But once television enters the picture, that transforms everything. It adds a constant, almost visual immediacy to political life. The idea then is a leader who not only governs, but also has Hollywood-style presence. And that's exactly what Kennedy had. But then you have to ask yourself, why was it so powerful? And I think part of the answer lies in the multifaceted nature of the image that JFK cultivated, even before he became president. He was known as a smart literary figure, very much thanks to his published books. He was also a war hero with a decorated record from World War II. And when he finally ran for Congress in 1946, he presented as the face of a family dynasty. There were Kennedys everywhere on the campaign trail. He also became seen as a sex symbol. And that wasn't just something that developed once he was famous. If you go back to 1946, when he was first running for office, you'll already find press coverage focusing on his looks and his appeal to women voters. In my mind, probably the most important voters. Women influence men. Women influence their husbands. So his image is layered. War hero, intellectual, family man, sex symbol. Then during the 1960 presidential campaign, a new dimension is added. Religion. His Catholicism became a national issue. Many Americans were openly prejudiced about the idea of a Catholic president. Would he answer to the Pope instead of the Constitution? And that was their major fear. Kennedy actually confronted it head on. He spoke clearly about the separation of church and state, and in doing so, added man of faith to his public persona. And I do think his religious devotion was genuine. Absolutely. Despite the contradictions in his private life, I think he was a sincere, practicing Christian. Then came his inauguration on January the 20th, 1961, a moment of pageantry and symbolism, I think so striking that it actually gave rise to the idea of the Kennedys as America's royal family. And that's actually where that phrase, really takes hold, and it's stuck ever since. But image isn't just about symbolism. it's also in the detail. JFK had a keen understanding of fashion and presentation. He knew how many buttons a jacket should have, what size, what width the lapels should be, what color socks go with these particular trousers. Magazines like GQ and Esquire wrote entire features just on his wardrobe. People talk about his hair, thick, youthful, perfectly styled, and it wasn't by accident. He sourced the best hair tonic from a boutique company in New York. It was all part of the careful crafting of his visual identity. And of course, then there's Jackie. Jackie, without a doubt, elevated his image in ways that were both subtle and I think also dramatic. JFK was intelligent and charming, of that there is no doubt, but Jackie brought culture. She was more intellectually refined than he was, and she was an unapologetic Francophile with a very, very deep love of art and classical music and design and theater. He didn't necessarily share those passions, but he admired them in her and supported her completely. The Kennedys, I think, as a political family, were all about business and power, but Jackie added something different. She brought sophistication. She hosted, cultural events at the White House, including a celebrated concert by the Spanish Puerto Rican cellist Pablo Casals in 1961, an event that made front page headlines. And, perhaps the most spectacular of all, in early 1963, Jackie was the one that arranged for the Mona Lisa to be loaned from the Louvre to the United States. It was described as the cultural event of the Kennedy presidency, and over 2 million Americans flocked to see it, not just because it was the Mona Lisa, but because Jackie Kennedy had organized for it to be there. So through Jackie, I think JFK's image as a cultured, refined leader was enormously strengthened. She didn't just complement his image, she expanded it. And of course, her presence also reinforced the idea of JFK as a family man. Because, of course, by then they had 2 young children. And that domestic image, the photogenic couple, the beautiful family, became a central part of how America saw the presidency. As I mentioned to you before, one of the most significant moments came shortly after the assassination, when she gave that powerful interview to Life magazine. As I said, she famously evoked the legend of Camelot, comparing JFK to King Arthur and his presidency to the golden days of the Round Table. And I think despite the overwhelming grief and horror, of actually what happened, and I don't want to get into that discussion, Jackie clearly thought strategically about how her husband should be remembered. She understood the power of the narrative. Privately, she expressed concern about how history might treat JFK, worrying that bitter old men might write the definitive version of his life and career. So she actually made it her mission to ensure that the public memory of JFK would be positive and enduring. That Camelot interview was actually part of her effort, and it worked. She helped solidify JFK's legacy, I think, as a noble, heroic figure cut down in his prime. And in doing so, she became an enormously influential force in shaping how generations of Americans would, in fact, remember him. Which, of course, leads us to the question that has fascinated historians ever since, me included. What might have happened if he hadn't been killed in 1963? His presidency ended prematurely after just about 1,000 days. And yet in that short time, monumental events took place. There was the Berlin Crisis in 1961, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and of course the rise of civil rights as a movement as a central political issue. And then, just as his leadership was hitting its stride, it's over. And I think because of that abrupt ending, historians have inevitably asked, what if? What might Kennedy have done had he lived? Unsurprisingly, views of this tend to break along familiar lines. I think historians who hold a negative view of JFK generally argue that things would have gone very badly if he'd served a second term. And of course, those who see him in a more positive light suggest that his presidency could have ushered in a new era of progress and stability. And of course, and I'm on that side. One key moment in that hypothetical timeline is the 1964 presidential election. By then, the Republican nominee was a guy called Barry Goldwater. He's a former Air Force general, a former congressman, and a very significant figure in the history of modern American conservatism. But at that time, Goldwater was viewed by many Americans as far too extreme. And I think it's a safe assumption that Kennedy, had he been running, would have defeated him comfortably. And of course, that would have meant a second Kennedy term, and his presence in the White House would have been seen throughout the 1960s. The big historical question then becomes, what would Kennedy have done about Vietnam? Because remember, Vietnam hadn't hit its stride yet. And this is the issue that most historians actually have debated the most. Would JFK have taken the United States into a full-scale land war in Southeast Asia, the same way his successor, Lyndon Johnson, ultimately did? Look, retrospect is a funny thing, but what we now know is that Johnson misled the American public about the scope and the nature of the war. By 1968, there were 500,000 American troops in Vietnam embroiled in a conflict that the U.S. would ultimately lose. It was a war that left very deep scars on the country, politically, culturally, and morally, even to this day. So the question remains, if Kennedy had lived, would Vietnam have played out differently? Would Kennedy have made the decision to go to war in Vietnam? I can only answer for me, and that answer is no. I don't believe he would have taken the United States into a full-scale conflict in Southeast Asia. And there are several important differences between Kennedy and his successor, Lyndon Johnson, that I think help my argument. First, by the time of his assassination, JFK had already established a strong reputation on foreign policy, largely thanks to his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. He had stood up and faced down the Soviet Union, effectively forcing Nikita Khrushchev to withdraw nuclear missiles from Cuba. And more importantly, he had avoided World War III. That singular achievement, keeping the world from the brink of nuclear disaster, meant Kennedy didn't need to prove his toughness or credibility on the international stage. Johnson, on the other hand, had little foreign policy experience, and I think he was seen primarily as a domestic policy president. And I'll go as far as to say that it's his insecurity in that area that may well have contributed to his decision to escalate war in Vietnam, to prove himself, to show that he could be strong in the foreign arena too. Second, if you look at Kennedy's trajectory on foreign policy, it's very clear that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was moving towards a more diplomatic, de-escalatory approach. He'd actually started to push back against the Cold War hawkishness. He'd signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and he gave that remarkable speech at American University urging Americans to reconsider their assumptions about the Soviet Union. And if you extrapolate that, for me, certainly it becomes less and less likely that he would have bought into the so-called domino theory. This idea that if Vietnam went communist, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow, which was essentially what he used as a pretext for entering that war full on. Kennedy was also increasingly skeptical of the advice he received from his military. He'd noticed a pattern. His generals always recommended aggressive, hawkish solutions. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, they urged him to bomb Havana, but JFK pushed back and refused. He asked them, if I bomb Cuba, will he attack Berlin? Will he then attack Turkey? And then where are we? Kennedy, to me, is the ultimate politician. He stands alongside Winston Churchill. He understood escalation in a way that the military seemed unwilling, maybe not unwilling, but certainly unable to consider. That skepticism actually really matters. He didn't blindly follow his generals. And I believe he would have received similar advice about Vietnam, and I believe he would have rejected it. Had he done so, 58,220 American lives might have been spared. So where does that leave us? Well, John F. Kennedy, war hero, sex symbol, literary darling, fashion icon, policy pragmatist, reckless romantic, cautious commander-in-chief. It's a lot to fit into one man, and he packed it all into just over 1,000 days in office. If he were a chapter in a novel that I was writing, my editor might say, dial it back, no one's that complicated. And yet, that's precisely what makes him so endlessly fascinating, isn't it? He was both larger than life and deeply flawed, capable of incredibly stirring speeches and eyebrow-raising behavior, often in the same day. He was a leader, I think, shaped by image, but not entirely defined by it. A man who could charm world leaders and Hollywood starlets while also thinking deeply about nuclear deterrence and civil rights. Would he have kept America out of Vietnam, extended the liberal consensus, mastered hair care routines well into his 70s? We'll never know. But I think what we do know is this. Few presidents have left behind such a dazzling and dizzying legacy. And whether you see Camelot or Contradiction, JFK remains, I think, one of the most compelling figures in American history. And I think he will do for a very, very long time to come. Thanks for dialing in, guys. Bye for now.